That's why the basidiomycetes have evolved this ability to break down lignin, is to get at the yummy stuff that it is hiding. Okay, back when we talked about ecology, we said that there were a lot of different possible interactions among species. Fungi participate in a large number of them, and sometimes they drift back and forth between one and another. So, for example, there are fungi that can be exploiters. Like here, for example, is a cordyceps fungus that has taken over the mind of an ant, convinced the ant to crawl high up into the canopy of a tropical rainforest and grab a hold of a leaf as hard as it can. At that point, the fungal hyphae proliferate in the ant's body, they kill the ant, and these fruiting stalks rise up out of its body. Because the ant is high up in the canopy, the spores that they generate rain down all over the ground, possibly finding another ant to victimize. However, a lot of fungi are kinder to their companions than the entomopathogenic fungi, like cordyceps. Many of them are mutualists. One of the most common mutualisms between fungi and other organisms are these. These are lichens. We'll talk a little bit about those later. But probably the most, well, certainly the most important mutualisms that fungi participate in are their mutualisms with plants as mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizae come in a couple of different flavors. First, there are what are called EMF, ectomycorrhizal fungi. In an ectomycorrhizal fungus, what you have is this network of hyphae, that's shown here in brown, that wrap around the root of plants. And they're little extensions of this mycelium in between the outermost cells of the plant root. In the other direction, hyphae reach out into the soil. What this does is it allows the fungus to collect things like nitrogen and sometimes phosphorus from the soil and deliver them very efficiently to the plant. Essentially what the plant is doing is it's feeding sugars to the fungus, and essentially as payment for a subcontractor relationship. It's subcontracting the uptake of nutrients to the fungus. The fungi are very good at taking things up from the soil, and so the plant is paying them to do it. I mean, alternately, you could say that plants are very good at generating high energy carbon compounds. They have photosynthesis going for them after all, and the fungus is paying the plant with nutrients in return for some of these sugars. The second flavor of mycorrhizae is arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, or AMF. And in these, the close relationship between the fungus and the plant is even closer, because the hyphae of the fungus extend not only between the cells of the plant root, but they'll go deep into the plant and actually go within its cell walls, contacting the plasma membrane of those plant cells directly. In the case of the AMF, these fungal hyphae basically are extensions of these plant cells, reaching way out into the soil and picking up nutrients, in this case chiefly phosphorus, and delivering them to the plant. The effect of this is to take the chief structural advantage of a fungus, which is its tremendous surface area, and allow the plant to take advantage of that structural advantage. It's that structural strength of a fungus. Probably about 80% of all land plants grow in close association with some kind of mycorrhizal fungus. And these associations may go back for 400 million years or so. And this is probably, apart from the mutualism between the mitochondria or the chloroplast and the ancient eukaryotic cells, the mutualism between plants and mycorrhizal fungi may be the most important mutualism that there is. want to get into a few key lineages of fungi that you should know. Here's the phylogeny of the fungi, and here are the 5 groups that you ought to be familiar with. As you can see, there are there are a handful of evolutionary innovations that have led to the fungi looking the way that they do today. You don't actually need to know these, but they might be useful for keeping track of who is who. The most basal group that I'm going to consider is the chytrid fungi, the Chytridiomycota, or the Chytridiomycetes, as they're sometimes called. You'll notice here that this is not a clade. The chytrids are not a monophyletic group. Instead, they're paraphyletic because some of the descendants of this ancestor are left out. Chytrids are thought to resemble the most ancient of the fungal lineages, sort of the ancestor of all the fungi. They live in a variety of different life cycles. Some are decomposers, some are parasitic, some are mutualists, but they live in water. And that's one thing that makes them different than most of the other fungi. Interestingly, they're the only fungi that have any kind of motile cells. Chytridiomycota have gametes and spores with a little tail on them, a flagellum, that allows them to swim through water. They're ecologically important as decomposers in some aquatic areas, but the thing that's most important about them today is that they are devastating the world's amphibians. There is a disease caused by chytrid fungi that can infiltrate there are chytrid fungi rather that can infiltrate the skin of amphibia. They cause a thickening of the skin, leading to a variety of health problems and ultimately death. They're lethal to most of the amphibians in the world. They are harbored in a apparently commensal relationship with one particular species of amphibian, but by now the chytrid fungus has been spread to many places all over the planet, and it's very deadly. It persists in the environment for long periods of time. It's lethal to most of the amphibian species that it encounters, and it's on its way to decimating the amphibian fauna of many, many places in the world. An amphibian expert that I personally met in the high altitude cloud forests of Costa Rica told me when we were out on a night hike that basically the forests there are silent now because the chytrid invasion has killed off the vast majority of the amphibians, mostly the calling frogs, in those forests. This is one of those species. The Monteverde golden toad was last seen in the 1980s. Then there were there were many, many thousands of them one year, then a few the next year, and then they were never seen again. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of amphibian species are following the fate of the golden toad and being driven extinct by this disease. The Zygomycota, or the Zygomycetes, is this group of fungi here, again, not a monophyletic group. They, unlike the chytrids, have evolved hyphae, those thread-like structures that make up the body form of most fungi. Most of these are decomposers, although interestingly, some of them are actually predators. They have hyphae that form loops that can grab a hold of very small animals called roundworms. And then the fungus infiltrates and digests the roundworm. Some of them are parasites on insects. The curious thing about the Zygomycota is that they form these yoked hyphae when they go through plasmogamy. You don't need to know the word zygosporangium, but it's this particular reproductive structure found only in this group of fungi. The zygotes that form here are very resistant to environmental harm. There's an extremely tough coating around the outside, and essentially what their strategy is to persist in the environment until the environment comes better for surviving and growing. Then they go through meiosis, form spores, and colonize the suitable environment around them. The glomeromycota are this group. It's a small group that I'm not going to really say anything about, except to say that all of the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are members of the glomeromycota. The basidiomycota are probably the fungi that you're most familiar with. That's because these are the ones that make things like mushrooms and toadstools. A lot of them form ectomycorrhizal relationships with trees. Some are parasitic, but this is the group that can completely digest wood, completely break down lignin. And of course, that's a very important job because otherwise there would be a tremendous amount of wood that would just persist and persist and persist in the environment. Mushrooms, brackets, and puffballs are the sexual structures of the Basidiomycetes. All of these structures result from heterokaryotic hyphae. And these hyphae have spore-producing structures called basidia at their tips. So what's basically happening in this mushroom is that the hyphae grow up out of the ground and they form this solid structure that has all these spore-producing tips on the bottom. That's the point of a mushroom, is to release spores from underneath into environments where those fungi may be able to make a living. What the fungus is trying to do is get up a little bit above the forest floor in this case, so that if there's any wind at all, those extremely light spores may be taken off into the distance where they may find a suitable place to grow. Here's a picture of where they occur in the life cycle. Again, the mushroom is over here. This is heterokaryotic. Only in the tips of these hyphae does meiosis occur, generating these genetically distinct spores that then go off and form their own mycelia. There are basically all of the fungi that you eat, and a number which you very definitely should not eat, since many fungi are lethal if eaten by human beings. But the fungi that you are most familiar with are all going to be in this group. Brackets, puffballs. Some of them can be eaten. These were collected by a friend of mine, and you can fry these up and have them for dinner. The cat is only here for scale. It is recommended, however, that you not ever gather wild fungi and eat them unless you are an expert at identifying them, because there are deadly fungi that look very much like many of the edible ones. Finally, the last group of fungi that I would like you to know are the Ascomycota, or Ascomycetes. These are the sac fungi. These are familiar to you probably because they are the ones that contribute to the formation of lichens. Lichens are actually not a single species. What you've got in a lichen is a mutualistic association between a fungus and some kind of photosynthetic organism, either a cyanobacterium or a green alga. The fungi form this hard, environmentally resistant outer coat within which the photosynthetic organisms are protected. And the photosynthetic bacteria or algae, and of course, generate photosynthate to feed the fungus. These organisms, or associations between organisms, whatever you want to call a lichen, are ecologically important because in some really barren cold areas like tundra, they can be the major producers. If you go very far to the north in the Arctic, you'll find areas where much of what you have as fur producers is simply lichens growing on rocks. The reproduction takes place in these organisms in a kind of a curious way, because any new propagule generated by lichen has to contain both partners. So what basically happens is that chunks of a lichen break off and are kind of spew out into the environment. These are called soradia, and they contain a little tiny bit of fungus and a few cells of the bacterium or algae. Where those land, they will attempt to grow into a new lichen. Finally, one interesting thing about the lichens is that they're one of the few organisms that can break down rocks. They grow incredibly slowly, but they can grow on the surface of a rock, and as they grow, they crumble it apart into dirt. You may remember the exercise that we did on primary succession after glaciers recede. Some of the first organisms that tend to come in primary succession, where you have bare rock and no life has really ever existed there. Some of the first organisms to come in are lichens, because they actually can subsist on this soil-free environment. And by breaking rocks apart, they start to make that environment more hospitable for other organisms that will come along later. Not all of the Ascomycota are lichen formers. Some of them are EMFs, ectomycorrhizal fungi. Some are saprophytes, decomposers, and some are parasitic.